Some assassinations have become seared on our collective consciousness: the killing of JFK in Dallas in 1963, or the murder of Martin Luther King soon afterwards. And anyone with even the most cursory interest in history will know all about the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, or, going even further back in history, the slaying of Julius Caesar. But what of those assassinations that made shockwaves at the time, but have been largely forgotten? There are countless examples where prominent individuals have been killed for political purposes, but who don't really appear in our history books. So, from presidents to prime ministers, senators to medieval diplomats, here we present 18 assassinations you might never have heard of. Number 1. Anton Cermak, the Chicago mayor who took an assassin's bullet for FDR. It was in his capacity as mayor that Anton Cermak welcomed President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt to Chicago on February 15, 1933. At the very moment the two men were shaking hands, Giuseppe Zangara pushed his way through the crowds with a gun in his hand. He took aim and pulled the trigger. At the exact moment he went to fire his pistol, a lady in the crowd by the name of Lillian Cross saw the danger. She used her purse to hit Zangara on the arm. His shot went wide. The bullet hit Cermak instead of Roosevelt. The mayor was rushed to hospital, fighting for his life. Roosevelt came to visit him on his deathbed. According to the legend, Cermak told FDR, "I'm glad it was me instead of you." To this day historians debate whether he actually muttered those words. The general consensus is that he did not. But still they are engraved on Cermak's tombstone, and the man is widely remembered as the man who took a bullet for one of America's great leaders. Some scholars, however, have argued that Cermak was indeed the real target that day. The assassin Zangara claimed after the event that his only real motivation was his hatred for the rich and powerful. However, given Cermak's campaign against organized crime in the city, it's reasonable to assume he had made his fair share of enemies in the Chicago underworld. Above all, Cermak's efforts to enforce prohibition not only made him unpopular with many ordinary Chicago folk, it also made him an enemy of Al Capone. Whether or not he was the intended target or if he did indeed save FDR's life that winter's day, Cermak has largely been forgotten, at least outside of Chicago. Zangara was executed by electric chair the following month, while Roosevelt would, of course, go on to serve in historic 4 terms of president, leading the United States through the Great Depression and then through the Second World War. Number 2. William Gooble was gunned down before he could be sworn in as governor. Most history fans can easily name all the American presidents to have been assassinated. Few, however, would be able to name the only state governor to have been assassinated while in office. That sad honor goes to William Justice Gooble. He served as governor of the state of Kentucky at the very start of the 20th century. But his time in office was short-lived. Very short-lived, in fact. He lasted just 4 days before succumbing to bullet wounds. Gooble was born to a family of German immigrants in Pennsylvania in 1856. Following the Civil War, his father moved the family down to Kentucky, where he went to school and then into a career in law. In 1887, Gooble became lieutenant governor. During his time in office, his abrasive nature made him many political enemies. So much so, in fact, he even shot and killed a rival in a duel. However, his policies, most notably his fight on the side of the common man and against the railroad lobby, earned him popular support. The 1899 Kentucky gubernatorial election was fiercely contested, but Gooble, controversially, came out on top. He headed to the old state capitol to be sworn in. Rumors of a plot to assassinate him ensured he traveled with 2 bodyguards, but they could do nothing to stop the assassin. 6 shots were fired from the nearby state building. Gooble was hit full-on in the chest. He was taken to hospital and was lucid enough to be sworn in there the following day. Just 4 days later, however, he died. According to legend, Gooble's last words were, "Tell my friends to be brave, fearless, and loyal to the common people." Google's only act as governor was to dissolve a militia formed by the Republican William S. Taylor in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. Taylor himself was implicated in the assassination, as were several of his key staff. Only one, however, was jailed, and even he was eventually paroled and then pardoned. Despite a wealth of research into the event, historians generally agree that the man who pulled the trigger and assassinated William Gooble, sitting governor of Kentucky, will never be identified. Number 3. Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme felt safe walking through Stockholm without a bodyguard, a fatal mistake. The assassination of Prime Minister Olof Palme on the streets of Stockholm in 1986 shocked a nation. Up until that point, political violence had been virtually unheard of in Sweden. In fact, no ruler had been attacked since 1792, the year King Gustav III was murdered. What's more, not only did Palme's cold killing change Swedish society for good, it also remains one of the great mysteries of modern European history. To this day, both the identity of the gunman and, perhaps more importantly, the reason for the murder, remain unknown. Palme was born in 1927 and showed an interest in politics from an early age. As a young man, he rose rapidly through the ranks of the Social Democratic Party, eventually becoming its leader. Palme served 2 terms as prime minister, firstly from 1969 until 1976 and then again from 1982. His second term was cut short, however. One evening when walking through the streets of Stockholm with his wife and without any bodyguards, a gunman shot at the couple from close range. Palme died, though his wife survived with minor injuries. A 33-year-old man known to authorities for his extreme views, was soon arrested but then released. Then, in 1988, Christer Pettersson was arrested. He was a drug addict with a history of crime, including manslaughter. Palme's wife even identified him as the assassin. Pettersson was convicted of the crime but soon released on appeal. Above all, he had no real motive for the killing, plus the murder weapon, a distinctive, large-caliber revolver, was never found. Ever since then, Palme's death has remained a mystery. Unsurprisingly, numerous theories have been put forward, including many infamous conspiracy theories. Throughout his political career, Palme was outspoken in his condemnation of many authoritarian regimes and dictators, including the USSR, as well as the Soviets, Kurdish activists, Chilean fascists, the CIA and even a rogue faction within the Swedish police force have all been named as the culprits. As well as history books, the Palme assassination has also been used as inspiration for numerous works of fiction, especially in Scandinavia. And, of course, no Swedish prime minister walks around without a bodyguard anymore. Number 4. Philip II of Macedonia's assassination paved the way for Alexander to conquer the world. Alexander the Great is widely recognized as one of the greatest military minds of all time. However, he may never have got the chance to make history had it not been for the assassination of his father, Philip II of Macedonia, in 336 BC. Indeed, it was Philip who was responsible for establishing the fearsome Macedonian army. He also devised the Macedonian phalanx, the strategy Alexander was to use to such great effect when conquering lands near and far. However, while Alexander is widely remembered and even has major Hollywood movies dedicated to his colorful life, Philip is relatively unknown, thanks in no small part to his premature death at the hands of an assassin. Philip was attending his daughter's wedding when he was struck down. As he was entering the temple, alone and unguarded, one of his own bodyguards, a man by the name of Pausanias, cut him down with his sword. Pausanias himself was then killed before he could reveal who had put him up to the killing or, far less likely, if he was acting alone. According to Aristotle, who provided us with the only contemporary account of the assassination, it might have been due to the fact that Pausanias had been offended by the uncle of Philip's wife. While this may sound tenuous, such slights often had fatal consequences in ancient Macedon. Some later historians have speculated that perhaps Alexander himself was, if not involved in the plot directly, knew about it, and did nothing to stop it. Certainly, the assassination of Philip II in 336 BC had huge historical implications. Had Philip still been on the throne, for instance, he might have been more restrained in the war against Persia. As it is, young Alexander was far more ambitious and set his sights on nothing less than conquering all of the known world. Number 5. Inu Katsuyashi's assassination meant that the military took charge of Japan, with huge consequences for world peace. The so-called May 15th incident was a pivotal moment in modern Japanese history. Before that infamous day in 1932, civilians had been in control of the country, with Prime Minister Inu Katsuya at the helm. Then, with his assassination, the military took the reins of power. Though the emperor was still the figurehead of Japan, generals were really in control of events, and it was the militaristic government that saw Imperial Japan embark on a series of colonial endeavors, ultimately resulting in the country becoming embroiled in the Second World War. Born into a prominent samurai family in 1855, Inu, after graduating from university, he pursued a career in journalism and then entered politics. He was a classic liberal, opposing the old dominant classes and keen to see Japan follow Britain's example and become a constitutional monarchy with a fully democratic parliament. When his political opponents failed to keep the economy under control, Inu's chance had come. In late 1932 he was invited to form a government and serve as prime minister. As prime minister, he faced an impossible task. While his supporters were keen to see him reign in the growing power of the military, the army and navy charged him with not being patriotic due to his lack of support for their imperial adventures. At the beginning of March 1932, the Japanese army proclaimed the state of Manchukuo in occupied China. Inu refused to recognize it diplomatically. In doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. On May 15, he was assassinated in his official residence in Tokyo. His killers were junior naval officers. They also planned to kill Charlie Chaplin, who was a guest of the Prime Minister at the time. However, he was away watching a sumo wrestling match, so their hopes of sparking a war with the United States through the murder of the comic actor were thwarted. Inu's assassins were apprehended but only received very light sentences. From then on, the Imperial Japanese Army took control of the country. Its policies became more and more aggressive. Only the 2 atomic bombs dropped by America in 1945 brought their rule to an end and saw Japan return to being led by a civilian government. Number 6. In Germany, Walter Rathenau's murder was first lamented but then celebrated by the Nazis. The period between the end of the First World War and the rise of the Nazi regime was a tumultuous one for Germany. The Weimar Republic might have been a golden age of culture, but it was also a political hotbed. Several prominent men and women on both sides of the political spectrum were subject to violence, with several of them assassinated. Among those who died was Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister of the fledgling republic. Born in Berlin in 1867, Rathenau's father was a prominent Jewish businessman who ensured his son worked hard at school. As a young man, he worked as an engineer and then a journalist. Then, when the First World War broke out, Rathenau served his country in an office, taking charge of logistics. When peace returned, he embarked on a career in liberal politics. After a spell as Minister of Reconstruction, he became Foreign Minister in 1922, a position that attracted the ire of the regime's enemies. Under Rathenau, Germany signed the Treaty of Rapallo with the Soviet Union, making trade between the two countries easier. To his critics, this was a bold move to ally Germany with the communists. Rathenau was called a revolutionary and the right-wing press called for his head, almost literally. On the morning of 24th of June 1922, Rathenau was assassinated. A trio of activists, all of whom would later join the Nazis, gunned him down in the street as he walked to work. The assassins hoped to ignite a civil war between the right and left, but they failed. Far from attacking one another, most German citizens united to show their disgust at the rising tide of political violence. Rathenau was seen as a hero of German democracy, and even a martyr against extremism. However, when the Nazis came to power, they made an effort to erase him from the history books. Not only were Rathenau's politics undesirable, his Jewish heritage also meant that it was his assassins who were celebrated as the heroes. Only with the end of the Nazi regime in 1945 was Rathenau's reputation, a liberal, moderate politician, resurrected. Number 7. Richard Welch, the CIA station chief gunned down on the street of Athens by revolutionaries. It was like something out of a Hollywood movie. A CIA station chief stationed in Europe is identified and then assassinated. Indeed, the killing of Richard Welch has featured in several novels, while also inspiring the plot lines of many more. But this was a real assassination, and one that, though it caused shockwaves at the time, has largely been forgotten. Welch, a Connecticut native who was born in 1929, went straight into the CIA fresh from Harvard University. Since he studied classics, he had an excellent working knowledge of Greek. So, in 1952, he was sent to Athens. After a few years finding his feet as a spy, he was moved to Cyprus, the Central America, and then on to Peru. In the summer of 1975, he moved back to Greece. His return coincided with the end of a military dictatorship in the country. Tensions were high, with activists on both sides of the political spectrum having turned to violence. It was when Welch was returning from an office Christmas party, on the evening of December 23, 1975, that the assassins struck. A man and a woman held his wife and driver up, while a third shot him at point-blank range. He was the first CIA officer to be assassinated in a targeted attack. The crime went unsolved for more than 20 years. In 2002, hospital porter admitted he was one of the 3 assassins. He also named his accomplices. Due to the statute of limitations in Greece, just one of the 3 culprits faced justice, and even he was sent to prison for other atrocities. Welch's assassination had an impact both at home and abroad. An investigation found that he had been named as a CIA agent, and his Athens address had even been made publicly available. After his death, the U.S. government passed the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, making it a crime to name or identify an undercover agent of the United States. Number 8. Edwin Stanton McCook was a Civil War hero, but an assassin's bullet brought his political ambitions to an abrupt end. The Fighting McCooks rose to prominence during the American Civil War. The soldiers of the Union Army respected and admired the brothers, while the men of the Confederacy feared them. In all, they numbered 15: Daniel McCook and his brother John, as well as 13 of their sons. Of these, Edwin Stanton McCook was one of the most talented. Indeed, he looked set to enjoy a notable career in politics to follow on from his decorated career in the military. However, an assassin's bullet ensured that this would never happen. McCook was born in Carrollton, Ohio, in 1837. After graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, he was well placed to join the Civil War as an officer. He took charge of the 31st Illinois Infantry and then got promoted to lead the division. He fought with distinction at the Siege of Vicksburg, winning the approval of Ulysses S. Grant and then President Andrew Jackson. His star was high, and so when he left the Army at the end of the Civil War, McCook looked destined for great things. In order to further his career, McCook moved west, to the Dakota Territory. Here he was named acting governor in 1872. Since he had been appointed to replace the crooked John A. Burbank, hopes were high that the new man could finally bring stability and then prosperity to the region. Indeed, had he been able to do so, McCook could have established himself as one of America's brightest political prospects, while his connections in Washington, D.C. and stellar Civil War reputation would have also helped him rise to the top. But that wasn't to be. On September 11, 1873, tempers flared during a public meeting on railroad expansion, held in a saloon. McCook was shot and killed by a political rival. Rather than going on to become president, McCook is now largely forgotten. The McCook County in South Dakota is named in his honor. Number 9. Was Roman Emperor Vitellius assassinated just because there hadn't been enough rain? While he may not be the most famous of all Roman emperors, in fact, he probably wouldn't even make a top 20. Vitellius is something of a favorite among historians researching ancient Rome. Though he enjoyed significant popularity with his people and, more importantly, with his army, he was ultimately assassinated. Moreover, this fall from grace was as rapid as it was fatal. Could the assassination of Vitellius in AD 69 tell us more about imperial Roman politics and why so many of its rulers were killed while in power? Vitellius was named emperor in April of AD 69. This was a particularly turbulent time in the empire, not least at the very top of the political pyramid. Almost from the start, he had challengers claiming that they should be the Caesar. Luckily for Vitellius, he had the backing of enough soldiers to ensure that any challenge would be repelled. Within a few months, however, his reputation had deteriorated considerably. That December, just 8 months after being crowned to much acclaim, Vitellius was dragged through the streets of Rome. Troops loyal to Vespasian led him to the infamous Gemonian Stairs, the site of many an execution. There he was brutally murdered. With no respect for his status, his body was thrown into the river Tiber. According to some scholars, the assassination of Vitellius serves as the perfect example of just how vulnerable Roman emperors really were. Far from being all-powerful, they were at the mercy of the whims of the crowd. More pertinently, they were at the mercy of their soldiers, and perhaps even the weather too. Research has found that the summer of 69 AD was especially hot and dry across much of the Roman Empire. Could it be that a lack of rain, with the poor harvest that resulted from this, was the reason why the once mighty Vitellius ended up dying the brutal death of a common criminal? Number 10. Luis Carrero Blanco. In 1970 Spain, the dictator's appointed heir was blown sky-high by assassins' explosives. In 1973, Francisco Franco, who had ruled Spain with an iron fist since the end of the Civil War in 1939, was close to death. Supporters of his regime regarded Prime Minister Luis Carrero Blanco as his natural successor as head of the Spanish state. The devoutly Catholic politician therefore became the number one target for the regime's enemies, above all for ETA, the Basque separatist group who were willing to use extreme violence to further their aims. For 5 months, a small team of ETA activists prepared for the attack. Posing as art students, they rented a basement flat on the street Carrero Blanco regularly drove down on his way to morning mass. They dug a tunnel under the road and placed explosives in it. Then, on December 20, 1973, they sprung their trap. The explosion occurred at exactly the right moment. The official car was launched 20 meters into the air, over a 5-story building. Though his driver and bodyguard were killed outright, Carrero Blanco miraculously survived the blast, though he succumbed to his injuries shortly afterwards. A few weeks later, ETA claimed responsibility for the assassination. Notably, the Spanish government in exile did not condemn the attack, and even today some people argue that, for all their atrocities and inexcusable violence ever since, ETA played a big part in ensuring democracy returned to Spain. Indeed, following the assassination, Torquato Fernández Miranda was proclaimed prime minister. Rather than imposing a state of emergency and cracking down ruthlessly on political factions opposed to the Franco regime, he instead called for calm. Within less than 18 months, Franco was dead. With no natural successor in place, the king returned to Spain and the slow process of transforming the country back into a parliamentary democracy would begin. ETA, meanwhile, continued their campaign of violence against the Spanish state for a further 3 decades.